Wednesday, September 6th, 2017. You are listening to Inception Radio Network, voice of the fringe majority. This is Carol Carl with UFO Headline News. We're beginning today with a new source for our sky watching enjoyment. It's the ibtimes.com with a writer, Nina Godlewski, covering their sky. Here's the headline: Full moon, September 2017. It won't be a harvest moon like usual. The full corn moon will take to the skies this morning. The September full moon is usually referred to as the harvest moon, with the exception of years during which September's full moon is not the closest full moon to the autumnal equinox. This year, the full moon closest to the equinox will be October, meaning that moon will be the official harvest moon. That's according to the Old Farmer's Almanac. This week's full moon is the corn moon or the barley moon because it occurs during the best time to harvest those particular crops. After this full moon and October's full moon, the moon will be rising sooner after sunset than usual. And when it does, it will hang big in the sky for some time before moonset the next day. That's also according to the Old Farmer's Almanac. The moon will be at its fullest at 3:02 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That was this morning. But if you try to catch it before that, you're probably going to still see a full-looking moon. And there's more going on up there. Neptune will make an appearance. As viewed from Earth, Neptune will come within 0.73 degrees of the moon around 1 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. You can look for Neptune using binoculars, or if you're lucky enough, a small telescope. It should be visible most of the night, but it will be at its highest point in the sky around midnight. It's currently mostly in the opposite position of the sun, which is what makes it visible for so much of the night. If you're hoping to get a glimpse of Neptune, now is your best bet for the entire year. You can check out the time for all the planet watching. There'll be a box later via link at ufoheadlinenews.com. The harvest moon in October will happen the first week of that month, on the 5th of October to be exact, but the moon will become full in the middle of the day, around 2:40 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The moon will still be visible, though, once the sun sets and it's dark, more visible, in fact. And while that moon won't be scientifically completely full anymore, to the naked eye, it won't appear any less full. Enjoy. Well, it's Way Back Wednesday, and we're still covering the Hudson Valley UFOs. Here's something to segue us right into that way back state of mind. It's a column by Cheryl Costa, her New York Skies blog. It was written November 7th, 2013. Let's read. Dutchess County in New York's Hudson Valley is no stranger to highly unusual UFO sightings. For example, it was a summer evening in June 1983 in Hopewell Junction near Poughkeepsie. Some people were celebrating the 4th of July a week early. They were shooting off some fireworks. As they were setting up for a second round of bangers, they began to hear a humming sound. They looked up to see a collection of bright lights in the shape of an arc. Within moments, it was clear to all of them that hovering above them was something resembling a huge disc. They report that it was the width of perhaps 16 or 17 houses, and that it literally covered the entire area of Jefferson Park. Of course, being dark, it was difficult for them to discern the exact features. The one thing that spooked all of them was that it was silent as a tomb as it hovered over them. After a few minutes, the craft then began humming again, turned, and left at incredible speed. And then there was a sighting over the IBM facility located in East Fishkill. It was a cold November evening in 1986. At about 9 p.m., the second shift workers were returning from lunch. The Observer reports that a huge triangular craft, dark in color, was hovering over the plant. It had 4 lights on it, one at each point of the triangle and one in the center. This object was reported to be perhaps a few hundred feet off the ground. It was estimated to be 1,000 feet long. The Observer states that at one point he licked his finger to determine wind direction and noted that the craft was leisurely and silently moving against the wind. He watched as the craft moved away from the building. It flew out of sight. When he reported this event to the New York State Police, He was asked about 15 questions related to direction and speed. And ultimately, he was told it was probably a group of ultralight aircraft. Very interesting. Something hovering over the IBM facility. Well, there was something hovering over the Indian Point nuclear facility. A little more serious, perhaps. And we're lucky enough to have an exclusive first-person interview. As amazing luck or synchronicity, you decide, gentle listeners, would have it, our very own Way Back Wednesday provider of the treasure trove of links and inspiration, our very own man in the high castle, might actually have been privy to a post-event, something that occurred after the Indian Point nuclear event in the Hudson Valley UFO flap. Are you there, man in the high castle?
I am, Carol. Felicitation and salutations to you UFO news listeners.
Well, we're glad to have you on board. And tell us about your incredible experience. The stage is yours.
Well, I know that you've spent the last week reviewing the Hudson Valley UFO cases, and I thought that you and your listeners might be interested in a little something that happened to two friends of mine and myself that very night, July 24th and 25th of 1984.
Absolutely. This is a unique opportunity.
Well, to begin with, my friend's younger brother was getting married the next weekend, which was August 4th. And that's the only reason I remember that this event actually took place on the 24th and 25th of July of 1984. But right. I hadn't put two and two together until only about 4 or 5 years ago when I read about the Indian Point nuclear facility UFO case. And something clicked in my mind, and I said, maybe that's what we saw that night when we were out fishing.
Amazing how that click happens, how something will just kind of go dormant, and then all of a sudden, boom, there it is. And what a pivotal event. The fact that he was getting married that next weekend, that would mark the date in time.
Well, what we decided to do was to go night fishing, to take him night fishing before his wedded bliss took him away.
Right.
And we decided to do it in the middle of the week instead of the weekend, which is what we used to do. But on the weekend, there are usually a lot of boats on the lake, and you kind of share a lot of fishing space. So we decided if we did this in the middle of the week, we probably would be alone, and there wouldn't be very many boats with us, maybe 1 or 2 other boats. And as it turned out that night, there were no other boats on the lake. We were the only boat on the lake. We had the entire lake to ourselves.
How would you describe the size of the lake, roughly?
Let me put this in context as to where this lake happens to be in relation to the Indian Point facility. It's a lake by the name of Twin Lakes, East Twin and West Twin Lake. It's up in Salisbury, Connecticut, which is way up in the northwest corner. It's actually very close to the border of New York. And straight across from that, by a factor of maybe about 25 miles, is the Hudson River. Mm-hmm. But it turns out that this lake is 65 miles as the crow flies from the Indian Point facility. So we were in fairly close proximity to the nuclear facility down there at Indian Point near Peekskill. And we got up to the lake on Tuesday, the 24th of July, and we launched the boat around 11:30 that night. And by midnight, we were in position on the lake where we wanted to fish. And we had anchored the boat. The boat was facing to the west, and we had hung the light off of the stern of the boat to attract the fish, and dropped our lines in the water and settled back in for what we figured would be a nice, quiet evening of fishing.
Little did you know.
Little did we know that we were about to be privy to an event that none of us had ever seen before, and my friend and his brother have never spoken of since.
Not unusual.
So as we fished, things were pretty quiet. And just before 1 o'clock in the morning, out of the corner of my eye, from out of the southwest, I could see a very bright light coming over a ridge line of small mountains that are to the southwest of the lake. And this light was headed right at us, and it was headed at us at a very, very high rate of speed.
How would you describe the quality of the light?
Well, it was interesting because when we first saw it, it looked like a combination of yellow and white, kind of shimmering light. It was moving very quickly in our direction, much faster than a jetliner at altitude would appear to someone on the ground. And I turned to them and I said, "Do you guys see this?" And they said, "Yeah, what is that?" I said, "I don't know what it is, but it's headed this way." And very quickly, this object, as it got closer and it got bigger, the lights that were on the object began to become more defined. And what we were able to see was that this was a triangular-shaped object that had 3 yellow lights on the left side, 3 yellow lights on the right side, a white line in between in the center, and a glowing red light underneath. And as these became more defined as it got closer to us, which happened very quickly. But before it reached the actual lakes themselves, this object stopped. Just absolutely stopped. And there was no sound. The lights themselves, the reddish light on the bottom, kind of pulsed a little bit. But the other lights were very consistent the way they were. Now, having been a pilot in the past, I can tell you that it's very difficult to tell at night the altitude of an object, the actual speed of the object, but from the distance this object was from us, which would probably have been maybe about 2 miles or so, since it had crested the ridge of these far, far mountains in the background. We had a very clear field of vision across the lake we were on, the other lake, cross fields to where this ridgeline was. I would say this object was probably somewhere around 900 to 1,000 feet in altitude. And here it was absolutely stopped dead. So none of us said anything. We just stared at this thing. And slowly, this object began to rotate in a clockwise manner. And it began to pick up speed. It went faster and faster and faster until all of the lights along the edges began to blend together. And the only single light that we could see was this reddish light on the bottom. And it spun and it spun and it spun and it sat there for probably close to 5 minutes. And then suddenly the spinning stopped and we could see it orientate itself so that we could only see 3 of the yellow lights along one side of this object and the reddish glow on the bottom. At that point, this object shot at a high rate of speed off to the west. Now, off to the west, there's a line of mountains that are basically just over the border into New York State. And this object went right over the top of these mountains, and it stopped again. And at that point, it began this process of this flat spin, clockwise spin, where it spun faster and faster and faster and faster until all of those 6 yellow lights and that white light in the front of it became kind of a blur. And it kind of repeated the process that it had done earlier. And it did this for probably about 2 minutes, at which point it began to slow down until it stopped. And we could see that and coming almost directly overhead to where we were, and then it stopped again. So at this point, being almost overhead now, what we really could see was this, you could see the white light in the front, kind of a glow from these yellowish lights on the side, and this red light that was underneath. And within a fraction of a second of stopping dead in the air, absolutely no sound to it, this object shot straight up at an incredible rate of speed, got smaller very quickly, and then it was gone. And the three of us sat there, and I turned to my partners and said, "Gentlemen, I think we just saw a UFO."
Wow. Well, that's where we weigh in. You just saw a UFO. And in the aftermath, was there discussion? Did you guys talk about this?
Well, his younger brother basically let out the proverbial holy shh.
Yeah.
And then there was no discussion whatsoever. They both went quiet. And I said, so guys, what do you think? And they were quiet. And then pretty soon his brother said, "You know what? I don't want to talk about it. I absolutely don't want to talk about this." And I said, "Okay, it's all right. Not a problem. We just won't talk about it."
Wow. Which is
So
not uncharacteristic in a lot of these events. It's just too much to wrap one's brain around, too much to try to assimilate into one's normal business of living.
Well, I can tell you, after 33 years, neither of them have discussed it with me since, except last year when my friend and I took my son, my adult son, up to the lake fishing. And so this was during the daytime, and we were having a great day of fishing. And at one point we decided that, well, maybe it's time to take a little bit of lunch. And we sat back, and I turned to my friend and I said, "Hey, do you remember that UFO we saw that night when we were up here fishing?" And he turned and he looked at me and he said, "Yes, I do." And my son looked at me, and I looked at my son because my son had heard the story before. And I said to my friend, "So what do you think about it?" And he says, "I think about it all the time. I don't know what it was. I don't know what its purpose was, but I really don't want to talk about it. But yes, I saw it. I know what I saw. You know what you saw. And I really still don't want to talk about it. But yes, I did see it." So at least my son was able to hear that, this was an event that happened. But it wasn't until a few years ago that I happened to be reading about the events in the Hudson Valley, and I read the description of the craft that the security people at Indian Point saw.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, you know what? That description is an awful lot like that object we saw that night when we were up on Twin Lakes fishing. So I started to do a little bit of digging, and I was able to pinpoint the night that we were up there by the day his brother was getting married.
Yes.
And worked my way back because we wanted to make this a special night for his brother just before, he got married and went off and whatever. And sure enough, here comes the night of the 24th and 25th of July of 1984. So it is quite possible that the three of us saw the same craft that the people at the Indian Point nuclear facility saw that evening. The time is right, the direction the object left, other witnesses saw it leave to the northeast. We saw it come from the southwest. This lake is 65 miles away to the northeast of Indian Point. And when I look at all of the data, it's very probable that what we saw that night was the same object that was seen at Indian Point.
How extraordinary. And how many characteristics this has, the reluctance of the witnesses to even talk about it, even after all that length of time. And trajectory-wise, it seems like you guys were indeed privy to something kind of extraordinary. What an amazing event. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Oh, by the way, did you guys catch anything that night worth keeping?
We did. We got 3 brown trout in the 20, 22-inch range, and we were pretty happy when we got off the lake at about 5:30 that morning. But we certainly weren't about ready to get in touch with the resident state police officer who lives actually just down the street from there to describe the event.
So you did not make an official report?
We did not make an official report, and at the time, none of us had any knowledge that MUFON or any organizations like that existed.
Oh.
It was way before the internet, so
yes.
Even to get in touch with an organization like that would have been a difficult thing to do. And so we just kind of let it go and have, for the last 33 years, just lived with the fact that we saw this that evening and have been left wondering ever since.
Wondering ever since. Wow, that's a great way to wind this up. Thank you so much, Man in the High Castle, for all your contributions, and especially this one, first person, the rest of the story regarding that strange craft and the Indian Point nuclear facility.
We're only left to wonder what treasures the Man in the High Castle will produce for next Wayback Wednesday. That's a hard act to follow. But as usual, we're following the clocks on the wall. All the time zones indicate to us it's time to fly, because that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to Inception Radio Network. Follow today's broadcast at UFOheadlinenews.com. Take care of each other. We're all in this together. This is Carol Carl. See you tomorrow.